$40 trillion. That is roughly the size of the entire United States national debt. And it is also the number a viral video attaches to a claim that the new Fed chair has a secret plan to quietly cancel your mortgage. There is no such plan, documented anywhere, in any Fed statement, any confirmation hearing testimony, or any policy paper. What actually exists is a real, technical, considerably less dramatic story about how the Fed's balance sheet decisions ripple through to your specific mortgage rate. And understanding that real mechanism tells you far more about where rates are actually headed than any invented debt cancellation story does. Quick housekeeping. I traced the actual mechanics connecting Fed policy to your mortgage rate, not just the headline-level claim about who the new Fed chair is. If that is useful, subscribe and turn on the bell. 2 seconds, and let's get into how this actually works. Start with who Kevin Warsh actually is, because his specific documented history is the entire basis for any real prediction about where rates go from here. The Senate confirmed Warsh as Fed chair on May 13, 2026, on a 54-45 vote, replacing Jerome Powell. Warsh previously served on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors from 2006 to 2011, becoming the youngest governor in the Fed's history. He resigned in March of 2011, specifically in opposition to a second round of quantitative easing, the Fed's large-scale bond buying program, notably after having voted in favor of the first round despite already having concerns about it, a track record that shows someone willing to go along with a policy institutionally while still publicly signaling disagreement, then eventually acting on that disagreement. Since then, he has been consistently characterized as a monetary policy hawk, skeptical of the Fed buying large quantities of mortgage debt or government bonds, and generally favoring higher rates as a tool against inflation over lower rates as a tool for growth. Here's the mechanism worth understanding in real detail because this is the actual technical story hiding underneath the vague, fake claim about mortgage cancellation. Your mortgage rate is not simply the Fed's benchmark interest rate with a markup attached. It is heavily influenced by the spread between mortgage-backed securities, bundles of mortgage debt that get bought and sold on financial markets, and Treasury bonds, the baseline, lowest-risk government debt investors compare everything else against. When that spread widens, meaning investors demand more extra return to hold mortgage debt instead of Treasuries, mortgage rates rise, even if the Fed's own benchmark rate does not move at all. When that spread narrows, mortgage rates can fall even without a Fed rate cut. This is not an abstract theoretical mechanism. It played out concretely earlier this year. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two government-sponsored entities that buy and guarantee a huge share of American mortgages, were directed to purchase roughly $200 billion in mortgage-backed securities. That specific action brought the mortgage-to-Treasury spread back down to around 1.8%, close to its long-term historical norm. Without that intervention, mortgage rates in early 2026 would very likely have been sitting meaningfully higher, plausibly at 6.5% or beyond, according to the analysis connecting that specific purchase to the spread it produced. In other words, a considerable share of why mortgage rates were not worse earlier this year traces directly back to a specific balance sheet decision, not primarily to the Fed's benchmark rate itself. Now connect that mechanism directly to Warsh's own documented preferences, because this is exactly where the real risk to mortgage rates actually sits, and it points in the opposite direction from what the fake claim promises. Warsh's track record and public statements point toward a preference for aggressively reducing the Fed's overall balance sheet, meaning less of exactly the kind of intervention that narrowed that spread earlier this year. If that support for mortgage-backed securities shrinks under his leadership, the spread has room to widen back out, and mortgage rates could rise even in a scenario where the Fed's benchmark rate stays completely flat. This is the actual technical version of what a hawkish Fed chair with a documented skepticism toward buying mortgage debt could mean for your specific rate, a meaningfully different and more precise story than either the fake cancellation claim or the equally oversimplified assumption that a Trump appointee automatically means falling rates. It is worth understanding exactly why that second assumption, Trump picked him so rates will fall, does not hold up against Warsh's actual record either. Trump has been publicly vocal about wanting the Fed to cut rates more aggressively. But Warsh's own documented economic philosophy, going back to his actual voting record and his actual public statements over more than a decade, consistently favors Fed independence from political pressure and a disciplined, inflation-focused approach over responsiveness to presidential preference. His first press conference as Fed chair, held June 17th, reinforced exactly this pattern, rather than contradicting it. He held rates steady rather than cutting them. The Fed's own internal projections released around that same meeting showed 9 of 18 Fed officials signaling support for raising rates before the end of the year, with 6 specifically projecting 2 separate quarter-point increases, a set of internal signals that runs directly counter to the narrative that this appointment was about delivering the rate cuts the president has publicly wanted. There is a structural check worth understanding clearly, too, because it limits how much any single Fed chair, hawkish or otherwise, can actually do unilaterally, regardless of personal philosophy. Interest rate decisions are made by the Federal Open Market Committee, a body of 12 voting members, not by the chair alone. Warsh holds real influence over the committee's direction and public messaging, but he is formally one vote among 12, meaning his own personal preferences, however well documented, still have to translate into actual committee consensus to become policy. A real institutional constraint on how quickly or dramatically Fed policy can shift, purely based on who holds the chair position. Step back and look at what the real, documented version of this story actually tells you compared to the fabricated one. There is no secret plan to cancel $40 trillion in anything, mortgage debt or otherwise, and no legitimate source, Fed statement, confirmation hearing record, or policy document supports that claim existing anywhere. What does exist is a specific checkable mechanism, the mortgage-to-Treasury spread, a specific recent example of that mechanism in action, the $200 billion Fannie and Freddie intervention, and a specific, well-documented new Fed chair whose actual track record points toward less of that kind of intervention going forward, not more, and toward higher rates for longer rather than a hidden path to relief. That is a considerably less dramatic story than a secret debt cancellation plan, but every piece of it is verifiable against real votes, real statements, and real Fed data, which is worth more than any amount of dramatic framing built on nothing. If breaking down the actual mechanism connecting Fed policy to your mortgage rate was useful, hit like so it reaches people trying to understand the real story instead of a fabricated one. And subscribe if you have not, because I will keep tracking Warsh's actual votes and the Fed's actual balance sheet decisions as they happen, not the exaggerated version of this story already circulating. Tell me in the comments whether you want the next video to go deeper into the mortgage-backed securities market specifically, or to track the Fed's upcoming meetings and how the committee's internal vote count actually shifts over the rest of this year.